The cold night air slightly burned his skin as BigShaq walked down a deserted London street, enjoying the silence after the resounding success of the concert. He held a plastic cup of tea in his hands, and a massive gold chain glittered around his neck, not just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of his hard work and status, earned with sweat and blood. Suddenly, the headlights of a patrol car caught him out of the darkness. The shrill sound of brakes broke the silence of the night, and the car door opened with a crack. A white policeman in a dirty uniform with a scowl on his face and a look of obvious contempt stepped out of the car. "Hey, you!" he shouted loudly, coming closer. "What are you doing here at this hour?" BigShaq slowly looked up. He already knew where this was going and inwardly prepared himself for another injustice. "Going home," he replied calmly, trying not to give cause for conflict. But that was not enough for the policeman. He examined BigShaq from head to toe, fixing his gaze on his chain and expensive sneakers. His lips curled in a grin full of venomous mockery. "Coming home? Or maybe you just robbed someone?" he asked, taking a step closer. There was a sneer in his voice, as if he was sure he had the right to judge by appearances. BigShaq exhaled, trying to contain his anger. "No, sir. I was just performing. I'm an artist." The policeman snorted as if he had heard the most ridiculous answer of his life. "An artist, huh? In your neighborhood, artists are those who sell dope around the corner." His voice grew louder, and he began circling BigShaq like a predator. "And that circus around his neck must be stolen, no other way." The crowd of passers-by began to stop, watching what was happening. BigShaq could feel the tension rising. The policeman was clearly enjoying his power, drawing out the moment to humiliate him in front of others. He knew that scenes like this had happened more than once. It was a reality he and others like him had faced all too often. But today, something inside him said it had to end. "Listen, sir," BigShaq said calmly, but his voice sounded firm. "I have done nothing wrong. If you have reasons to detain me, show them. Otherwise, let me go." These words apparently touched the policeman's heart. His face reddened. He sharply approached BigShaq and, without hesitation, grabbed the gold chain, tearing it from his neck. "Stop telling me what to do," he shouted. "People like you always have a reason to be in trouble." The chain fell to the ground, glinting in the light of the street lamp. BigShaq froze, feeling a storm rising inside him. The crowd whispered, and phones went off, recording every second of what was happening. And it was at this point that the game began, in which the policeman did not even realize that he had already lost. The chain seemed to glisten brighter than usual, lying on the pavement under the streetlight. The glitter only irritated the policeman, whose face was twisted in a smug grin. He bent down, picked up the chain, and twirled it in his hands as if examining a trophy. "Well, well, well, what do we have here?" "Gold?" he said mockingly, eyeing the massive piece of jewelry. "I wonder how many robbed victims have paid for this bling." BigShaq stood still, but there was a barely contained anger in his eyes. This chain was more than just an accessory to him. It was a symbol of his journey, a victory over the circumstances that tried to break him. And now it was in the hands of a man who saw him as nothing more than a stereotype. "Give back my chain," BigShaq said calmly but firmly, his voice cutting the silence like a knife blade. The policeman laughed loudly, turning to the crowd, which was growing larger. People had already taken out their phones, filming his every action. "Give it back? How about you explain how you got it first?" He lifted the chain higher so everyone could see it. "You expect me to believe that a guy like you could make an honest buck for something like that?" BigShaq stepped forward, but the policeman immediately put out his hand, stopping him. His voice became colder and his words even more barbed. "Back off," he said threateningly. "Do you even know who you're talking to? I represent the law, and people like you are used to breaking it." The crowd gasped. One bystander shouted, "That's racist." But the policeman paid no attention. His face broke into a crooked smile of superiority. "You know what I think?" he continued, addressing BigShaq again. "I think you're just another petty thief who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That chain doesn't belong to you, and if it does, prove it." BigShaq felt his fists clench, but he restrained himself as best he could. He had seen scenes like this before, the kind that ended in cruelty, humiliation, and pain for those who failed to stop in time. But today, he decided that the situation would be different. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, looking the policeman straight in the eye. His voice remained firm, but you could literally feel the tension in the air. "Give me my chain back. Now." The word sounded like a challenge. The policeman frowned, then abruptly threw the chain back to the ground. But his actions spoke louder than words. He leaned toward BigShaq and spoke so that only he could hear. "You may think you're somebody important, but to me, you're just another cocky black guy who got his nose too high. And if you think anyone here's going to stand up for you, you're sorely mistaken." These words squeezed BigShaq's heart with a steel hoop. There were indignant cries in the crowd. Someone shouted that everything was recorded on camera. But the policeman still acted as if he were untouchable. BigShaq straightened, his gaze as sharp as a razor. He knew the world would see this, knew that this man had already made a mistake that would cost him everything. But he also knew that this moment was not just his personal battle. It was the voice of all those who had been silent for too long. Silence descended on the street again, as if the whole world had frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. The moment BigShaq took a step forward to pick up his chain from the ground, the policeman suddenly grabbed him by the shoulder. The grip was rough, defiant, as if the gesture was a show of force. "You think you can do whatever you want, huh?" he hissed. "These aren't your ghetto streets." These words were like a blow to the face. BigShaq stopped, his body tensed, but he still tried to keep his composure. The crowd around him was growing larger. People were whispering. Shouts of indignation could be heard. But the policeman seemed to enjoy his position, his tone becoming more and more insulting. "Look at you," he continued, ostentatiously looking BigShaq over from head to toe. "All in gold, dressed like a drug lord. That's normal for you, isn't it? Living off other people's money, squeezing money out of honest people. It's in your blood." Pain and humiliation flared in BigShaq's chest. He clenched his fists, feeling the anger come in waves. But he still held on, knowing that any sudden movement could be the occasion for a new round of violence. "I said, give me back my chain," he said, his voice deep and firm, but there was a note of warning in it. But the policeman was not going to stop. He stepped closer, and suddenly, before anyone could react, he jerked sharply at the chain still hanging around BigShaq's neck. The sound of the lock breaking sounded deafening, like a gunshot. The chain, glittering, fell into the policeman's hand. BigShaq took a sharp breath. This wasn't just a physical act. It was an attack on his dignity, his identity, on everything he represented. "That's different," the policeman said with a smug smile, tossing the chain in his hand like a toy. "Now you look like someone who knows his place." These words were the last straw. Shouts of outrage began to erupt in the crowd. Someone shouted, "This is a violation of the law." Others begged BigShaq to hold on. Phones kept filming, capturing every moment. But the policeman seemed to feel untouchable. "You know what the funniest thing is?" he continued, moving closer to BigShaq so that their faces were on the same level. "You can buy yourself gold, clothes, even fame. But respect? You'll never get it. Respect must be earned, and people like you are not capable of that." It was so quiet that you could hear the raindrops starting to hit the pavement. BigShaq slowly looked up, and the policeman met eyes in which determination burned. He realized that he had made a mistake. It was the moment when humiliation turned into a challenge. BigShaq was no longer just a victim. He was a symbol of resistance, a man who was not going to silently tolerate injustice. And it was at this point that things began to change. The shining chain in the policeman's hand seemed brighter than anything else on the street, as did the attention of the crowd, now fully focused on what was happening. BigShaq stood motionless, but his gaze was heavy, as if made of stone. His calmness was intimidating, almost supernatural, especially in the face of what everyone expected to be an outburst of anger. He stepped forward so that there was only an arm's length between him and the policeman. The crowd froze. This was more than just a conflict. It was a clash of two worlds, two realities that could never coexist peacefully. "Listen carefully, sir," BigShaq began, his voice low but sounding as if everyone within a kilometer could hear him. "Do you think that by breaking this chain you have deprived me of something important? You're wrong." The policeman snorted, tossing the chain in his hand, but his sneer didn't seem so confident anymore. Something in BigShaq's stance, in his calm but powerful energy, made him feel uncomfortable. "It's just gold, a metal that can be replaced. But what you have done shows your true colors," BigShaq continued, looking straight into the policeman's eyes. "You didn't just rip off the chain. You tried to tear off my pride, my dignity, my history. And you know what? You didn't succeed." The crowd murmured, some clapped, others shouted words of encouragement. The policeman, clearly sensing the mounting pressure, threw his chain to the ground with demonstrative anger. "You talk too much," he snapped, trying to get the situation under control. "You better give me some ID or I'm going to arrest you right now." BigShaq, without moving from his seat, spoke again, his voice firmer. "You want to know who I am?" He stepped forward, ignoring the threat. "I am a man who will not allow you to use your badge to humiliate others. I'm the man who will make sure that every word you say, every action you take today, is known to everyone." The policeman tensed visibly. His eyes darted toward the crowd, which was now actively filming what was happening. BigShaq caught this moment and added, "Look around you. People see you. They hear you. And even if you are holding this chain now, the power is no longer in your hands." There was silence, piercing and oppressive. The policeman seemed confused, realizing that his actions had already become public. The crowd slowly began to support BigShaq with applause and cheers. But BigShaq was not finished. He went down on one knee, slowly picked up the chain from the ground, brushed the dirt off it, and put it carefully in his pocket. Then he straightened up, squared his shoulders, and looked at the policeman with that calmness which can only be found in a man who knows that the truth is on his side. "It was your choice, sir, and now you will be held accountable for it," he said. The words sounded like a gong. The policeman took a step back, his face beginning to blot with irritation and fear. The crowd murmured even louder, shouting words of support for BigShaq and condemnation against the officer. It was at that moment that BigShaq realized he had done the right thing. He had maintained control. He had not let them rob him of his dignity. But more was yet to come, to make this moment a lesson no one would forget. The crowd grew like a fire in the wind. People were slowing down, coming out of nearby stores, and almost everyone was holding a phone in their hands, filming what was happening. Contrary to common sense, the policeman seemed to relish the attention. His posture became even more self-assured, as if the stares were fueling his desire to prove his superiority. "Dismissed!" he shouted loudly, waving his hand, but no one moved. Instead, there were muffled whispers and comments in the crowd that grew louder and louder. "What's he doing?" one woman asked, filming on her phone. "That's racist. He's only attacking him because of his skin color," shouted someone from the back row. BigShaq stood with his arms folded across his chest. His face remained calm, but inside he felt how every glance of the crowd gave him strength. He knew. The people see everything. They see this ostentatious display of power. They see the humiliation they were trying to inflict on him. And now it wasn't just his battle. It was in full view of the entire city. The policeman did not see that the situation was out of his control. His voice was louder than it should have been, and his words became increasingly harsh. "I said, disperse," he shouted, turning to the crowd. "This is police business. There's nothing to see here." His attempts to quell the crowd only made matters worse. Someone shouted, "Police business? It's open humiliation, and it's all on the record." The policeman turned to BigShaq, his face flushed with irritation. He clearly felt that he was losing control of the situation, but his actions only made things worse. Instead of retreating, he took a step closer to BigShaq, as if trying to assert his position. "You think you're a hero?" he growled. "You're not the star here, kid. All you are is just a puffed-up shell playing to the cameras." These words again sparked outrage in the crowd. People started shouting protests. "That's racist. What kind of outrage is this? We can all see what he's doing." At that moment, a woman in the crowd, an elderly African-American woman, stepped forward. She raised her finger, pointing at the police officer, and said loudly, "My father fought for equal rights, and he wouldn't have let you, sir, do what you're doing now. We're not going back to the days when you could humiliate people just because of the color of their skin." The crowd burst into applause. The policeman froze, stunned by this direct challenge. He looked back at the growing crowd, realizing that his power was beginning to dissipate. BigShaq stepped forward towards the officer and said loudly and clearly, so that everyone could hear, "Look at them. This is not just a crowd. These are people who see the truth. They see what you've tried to hide. And now, sir, you will be tried not only before the law, but before their eyes." The crowd erupted into loud applause and shouts of approval. The policeman took a step back, his confidence shaken. He tried to maintain a semblance of control, but it was clear even to him that the situation was beyond his control. At that moment, a siren wailed in the distance. Another police car was approaching. The crowd did not disperse, but stepped aside to let the new patrol pass. Now, everyone realized that the story was just beginning. The sirens grew louder and louder as they approached the empty street, but none of those gathered even thought of dispersing. The crowd had already reached a critical mass. Dozens of people, excited, outraged, with phones at the ready, were recording every moment of what was happening. People continued to whisper and discuss the situation, But suddenly, one of the eyewitnesses, a young guy in a sweatshirt, shouted, blocking out all the noise. "Hey, it's BigShaq. Can't you see who it is?" The words ripped through the air like a thunderclap. The policeman froze. His gaze, previously filled with smug anger, became glazed. He slowly turned back to BigShaq, trying to comprehend what he had heard. "Who?" He mumbled confusedly, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. A guy in the crowd stepped closer, holding his phone high above his head. "BigShaq, a legend. This man is an icon," he shouted, pointing at BigShaq. "He gathers halls. Millions of people know his songs. Do you realize what you have done?" The policeman slowly shifted his gaze to BigShaq, as if looking at him for the first time. His eyes widened and his mouth opened slightly at the sudden realization. Suddenly, scraps of memories began to form a coherent picture. The posters on the buses, his kids humming "Man's Not Hot," even the voice he'd heard on the radio a few days ago, all of it belonged to the man who stood before him now. "This is some kind of mistake," he muttered, glancing back and forth at the crowd, his confidence fading with each passing second. But the crowd was already beginning to boil over. Someone shouted, "Now, do you realize who you were trying to humiliate? You thought you could rip the chain off his neck and no one would say anything? It's all on video, man. You're in big trouble." The policeman took a step back, his face turning scarlet red. He grabbed the radio on his shoulder as if it could save him, but even that gesture looked useless in the eyes of those watching. He was no longer a representative of the law. He was a man who had made a huge mistake in the face of everyone. "Yeah, I didn't know who you were," he muttered, turning to BigShaq, but the words sounded unconvincing, like a pathetic excuse. BigShaq looked at him calmly, his face remaining cold and collected. He realized that this moment was more important than personal conflict. It was a moment of exposure, not just of a particular policeman, but of the entire system that allowed such situations to occur. "Does it change the essence of your deed?" BigShaq asked, his voice so loud that the crowd froze. "You thought you could humiliate a person because you thought no one would notice. But the truth is that I am just one of many. You would have done that to anyone else who looked like me." The policeman gasped, as if he couldn't find the words. The siren of the police car grew louder, and soon a second patrol arrived at the scene. Two officers got out of the car, their faces a mixture of surprise and alarm, as they saw the crowd of people and the recognizable figure of BigShaq in the center. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked loudly, coming closer. Before the policeman could say anything, the crowd started talking in chorus. People shouted out details of what had happened, some even showing their phones with recordings of the incident. BigShaq stood still, not saying a word, but his presence was strong enough that the new officers quickly realized that something serious had happened here. "Is it true?" one of the officers quietly asked his colleague, who now looked like he wanted to fall through the ground. "Yeah, it was a mistake," he began, but the words sounded as pathetic as his position. BigShaq finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a sense of unwavering strength in it. "It's not a mistake. It's a course of action. You acted that way because you thought no one would find out and no one would stand up for you. But you were wrong. Now everyone will see it." The crowd broke into applause. People shouted words of support for BigShaq, condemned the policeman, and demanded justice. Officers from the second patrol began to disperse the people, trying to calm the crowd, but it was too late. The video had already gone viral, spreading around the world. The police officer's mistake became a national scandal. The policeman, realizing that his career and possibly his life would never be the same again, lowered his head. His face expressed the realization that what he had done could not be undone. BigShaq turned away from him, preparing for a new, more significant step to follow. This moment was already history, but the real battle was just beginning. The crowd did not subside. Every shout, every outcry exposed the anger that had built up over the years in those who had witnessed similar situations. Hundreds of eyes stared at the policeman, making him feel as if he were standing under a spotlight on a stage, but instead of applause he heard only condemnation. "Let's talk calmly," he began, raising his hands as if trying to stop a barrage of accusations. His voice trembled, and it did not escape the crowd. "I admit I made a mistake." His words were met with an explosion of indignation. "A mistake?" shouted a man from the crowd. "A mistake? You humiliated him because of the color of his skin, and you call that a mistake? It's not a mistake, it's your essence," shouted the old woman, her voice trembling with rage. The policeman stepped back, clearly overwhelmed by the flurry of emotion. He turned again to BigShaq, who stood still, his gaze sharp and piercing. "Sir," said the policeman, looking at BigShaq with despair in his eyes. "Yeah, I sincerely apologize. It was a misunderstanding. I didn't realize who you—" This phrase, like thunder, set the crowd on fire again. The people shouted, "Who are you?" So, with others, he would have kept it that way. You wouldn't apologize if he didn't turn out to be a celebrity. Even amidst the noise and shouting, the words came out loud and clear. BigShaq pressed his hands into the pockets of his jacket, his calmness never leaving him, though his anger boiled inside him. He stepped closer to the policeman, their gazes meeting. "You don't apologize for what you did," BigShaq said in a cold, even voice. "You only apologize for getting caught." The crowd supported him with shouts of approval. The policeman turned pale, realizing that his words were not achieving their purpose. He looked back at his colleagues, but they stood silent, clearly realizing that the situation was beyond their authority. "I'm ready to take responsibility." He started to justify himself, but his voice was again drowned in the crowd's shouts. "You ready? Who's going to ask you?" shouted a teenager from the crowd. "Now it will all be decided by the court and by society." Meanwhile, more people were pulling up to the site of the event. Social media was already buzzing, and eyewitness videos were spreading at the speed of wildfire. The faces of the crowd were glowing from their phone screens, and every new shot, every post added fuel to the fire. The policeman tried to speak again. "I realize what I did was wrong. I apologize to anyone who may have been offended by it." "Could have offended," loudly interjected someone in the crowd. "It insulted all of us. You don't even realize what you've done." BigShaq raised his hand, calling the crowd to silence. His voice came out loud and clear. "Look, officer, you want to apologize, but this is not a matter of personal forgiveness. This is a matter of public concern. You want me to accept your apology so people will believe it's okay. But I can't accept that you don't understand your mistake." The policeman lowered his head, as if realizing that the situation had gone too far. But the crowd did not let him go. One by one, people shouted their stories of injustice, of racism, of how such behavior had ruined their lives. The atmosphere was heating up, and there was no doubt that apologizing wouldn't change anything. Suddenly, one woman stepped forward. In her hands was a printout, an article about BigShaq, its history, its successes. She raised it in the air and shouted, That's who he is. This is a man who proved that you can rise from the bottom, and you wanted to humiliate him just because he's a successful black man. Is that your apology?" The crowd broke into applause. The policeman realized that every word he said only made things worse. His eyes darted around like a cornered animal, and he began to retreat. BigShaq took one last step forward, looking him straight in the eye. "Today you apologize, but tomorrow people like me will be stopped, searched, humiliated again. Your apology is an attempt to avoid consequences, not an admission of guilt. And I'll tell you one thing, you won't be answering to me now. You will answer to everyone standing here, to everyone who sees this video." The crowd exploded with applause. People shouted words of support, chanted BigShaq's name, and condemned the police officer's actions. Amid these sounds, the officers who arrived to help tried to defuse the situation, but it was no longer possible. The policeman's mistake became a symbol of something much bigger than he could have imagined. BigShaq turned around and, raising his head, walked through the crowd. The people parted, applauding him. This moment was no longer a personal struggle, it had become a movement, part of something greater. And behind him, in the center of the crowd, remained the policeman, who now realized that no one wanted his apology, and it was too late to try to fix anything. The crowd froze in anticipation, as if the whole world had stopped to hear what BigShaq would say. His face, expressing a mixture of anger and determination, became a symbol that justice is possible even in the most unjust moments. He raised his hand, calling for silence, and his voice cut through the noise of the crowd like a peal of thunder. "There was an attempt to humiliate me here today. Not just me, anyone who looks like me. And I'll tell you all, there will be consequences." These words, sounding like a manifesto, made the crowd come alive. People applauded, shouted words of support. But BigShaq did not stop. "We will not be silent anymore," he continued, turning to the police officers who stood behind their colleague, clearly confused by what was happening. "You can't use your badge as a weapon against people who have done nothing wrong. You think your position protects you, but today the world will see the truth." The policeman, who only a few minutes ago had been trying to justify himself, turned pale. He stepped forward, trying to speak again, but BigShaq gestured to stop him. "Your words don't mean anything anymore," he said coldly. "Your actions speak now, and I will make sure the world sees them." As soon as the crowd began to disperse, BigShaq took the phone of one of his friends and opened a live broadcast on social media. Thousands of viewers connected almost instantly, and a few minutes later, the number of viewers exceeded 100,000. On air, he told the whole story, from the unfair stop to the chain-breaking and attempts to humiliate his dignity. "This is not just my case," he said, looking directly into the camera. "This is what happens every day to people who can't defend themselves. But today, we're going to say enough is enough. This will not go unnoticed." His video instantly started gaining popularity. The comments flooded in. "We're with you, BigShaq. It's time to put people like him in their place. Justice must be done." By morning, his broadcast had been viewed by millions. It wasn't just a scandal, it became a national topic. The next day, BigShaq turned to his lawyers. His legal team, known for its unrelenting fight for justice, immediately began preparing a lawsuit against the police officer and the department he represented. They filed charges of racism, abuse of power, and moral turpitude. "We are not only demanding compensation," his lawyer said at a press conference. "We demand reforms. This case is not an isolated one. This is a systemic problem, and we intend to fight to the end." The media picked up the story instantly. BigShaq became the face of the anti-racism movement in law enforcement. His pictures and quotes appeared on the front pages of newspapers and websites. People began to take to the streets en masse in support of justice. Meanwhile, the police department tried to defend its officer, saying the incident was a misunderstanding. But this statement only angered the public. Under pressure from public opinion, the police officer who ripped the chain off the BigShaq was suspended, and an internal investigation was launched. But that wasn't enough for BigShaq. "Suspension is not a punishment," he said at another press conference. "It's just a way to keep things quiet. We will not stop until we see real change." During the week, protests spread to several cities. People took to the streets with placards, chanting slogans for equality and justice. BigShaq became the leader of this movement, speaking at rallies and calling for peace but perseverance. "We do not ask for justice, we demand it," he said to the crowds that had gathered in thousands. His words became not just a slogan, but a cry of the soul that resonated with all who faced injustice. A few weeks later, the BigShaq case was heard in court. The police officer responsible for the incident was dishonorably discharged, and a criminal case was filed against him. Moreover, the case became a catalyst for a review of law enforcement policies, which led to new trainings on combating racism and discrimination. BigShaq did not stop there. He used all the proceeds from the case to create a foundation to support victims of racism. His foundation funded legal aid, educational programs, and initiatives to combat systemic injustice. "This is just the beginning," he said, addressing thousands of people at one of the rallies. "We have shown that we cannot be broken. We have shown that justice can be achieved, and we will continue to fight until every one of us feels safe." The events of that night changed many things, but most importantly, they changed people's perceptions. Every person who watched the BigShaq struggle felt that their voice mattered, that they could contribute to a more just society. BigShaq, who became a symbol of resistance and leadership, never forgot that night. It reminded him that the struggle for justice is not a moment, but a movement. And now he was ready to wage that battle to the end. The internet lit up like wildfire. The video of the incident where a policeman humiliates BigShaq was everywhere, on social networks, on news sites, in memes. Millions of views turned a random night out into an international scandal. The policeman, whose face and name everyone now knew, became a symbol of everything society hated about the abuse of power. By the morning after the video was published, social media had exploded with hashtags: "Justice for BigShaq," "Stop Racism," "Hold Them Accountable." People shared the video, discussed the situation, and demanded immediate punishment for the officer. Celebrities, activists, and politicians from around the world joined the scandal. Even major news outlets broadcast footage of the incident with comments about systemic discrimination. "It's not just BigShaq," said a popular TV anchor on his late-night show. "This is everyone who has ever faced this kind of humiliation. We will no longer remain silent." The policeman's name soon surfaced online, and his life changed in an instant. The internet was ruthless. Thousands of users posted his photos, address, personal information. Fear and pressure began to grip him like a vice. The policeman tried to remain calm, but his life quickly turned into a nightmare. Journalists besieged his home, his colleagues refused to support him, and his superiors distanced themselves to avoid negative publicity. Public opinion was unanimous. He was guilty. "We don't want people like him to wear uniforms," protesters said outside the police headquarters. The policeman's neighbors told reporters that his family also suffered attacks. Public anger was unstoppable. Graffiti with the words "payback" and "justice" appeared outside his house. The officer's family moved in with relatives, and he became virtually isolated. "I never thought a normal day at work would turn out this way," he said in an interview that many took as a pathetic attempt to justify himself. "I didn't mean any harm. It was just a misunderstanding." These words only increased the fury of the public. People saw them as a refusal to admit their guilt. They demanded real consequences. The police department issued an official press release stating that the officer was suspended while the investigation was ongoing. However, this was not enough to calm the community. Crowds of people besieged the department building, shouting slogans and demanding his dismissal. "If he is kept on duty, it will be proof that the system supports racism," shouted one of the activists. Soon, the police officer's superiors realized that his further stay in the police force was simply impossible. A week after the incident, the officer was dishonorably discharged. This decision was accompanied by a press conference where the head of the department tried to distance himself from the actions of his subordinate. "We condemn all forms of discrimination and abuse of power," he said. "Such actions do not reflect the values of our service." However, the statement drew mixed reactions. Many saw it as an attempt to save the reputation of the police rather than a sincere act of condemnation. A police officer who was out of work faced a wave of hatred that did not subside. He started receiving threats on the phone, in letters, on social networks. Every day he opened his mail, expecting another letter with death threats. "You have ruined your life and put us all to shame," a former colleague wrote to him. His attempts to seek support from friends and family were met with cold rejection. Many of them were shocked by his behavior, which turned out to be recorded on video. Even those who had been willing to support him realized that it had now become too dangerous. The cop's name became a household name. People created caricatures, memes, mockeries. His story became the subject of discussion in talk shows, documentaries, and even in school classes, where it was cited as an example of abuse of power. "When you choose the path of humiliating others, you sign the verdict of your own reputation," said a famous psychologist in one of the interviews. The policeman tried to see a psychologist, but even there he could not find comfort. Every day he was haunted by images of that evening, his own words and BigShaq's face, full of strength and determination. His life, which he thought was stable and successful, collapsed in an instant. Everything he had turned to dust. He spent weeks in isolation, afraid to go outside. Even going to the store was accompanied by whispers behind his back and reproachful glances. In his home neighborhood, people turned away, children pointed fingers at him, and neighbors refused to say hello. The BigShaq case was a turning point, not only for society but also for the policeman himself. His life became an endless echo of the humiliation he tried to impose on another person. He became a living reminder that abuse of power and discrimination will not go unnoticed. But most painful to him was the realization that this humiliation had been caused by his own actions. And now he couldn't get back what he had lost. 2 months after the incident, the streets were still buzzing with protests and rallies. BigShaq's story, recorded on phones and shared on the internet, became an international symbol of resistance to racism and abuse of power. However, for BigShaq himself, this case was not only a personal challenge, but also an opportunity to become a voice for change. BigShaq has actively used his platform to speak out about issues that millions of people face every day. He has appeared on the world's leading talk shows, released a series of videos on social media, and even addressed the UN at a human rights-themed conference. "This case was not just about what happened to me," he said in his speech. "It's about every person who lives in fear of injustice. It's about those who cannot raise their voices. I am here today to say, enough is enough." His words sounded like a cry that was heard by millions. People began to share their stories, their personal encounters with racism and discrimination. BigShaq's story inspired thousands of people to fight for their rights. Using funds from the lawsuit and donations, BigShaq founded the Voice for the Silent Charitable Foundation. The foundation's mission was to provide legal and psychological assistance to victims of racism and discrimination. "This is not just an organization," he said at a press conference to launch the foundation. "It is a beacon of hope for those who feel lost." The foundation has also funded educational programs for youth, anti-bias training for law enforcement officials, and human rights awareness campaigns. BigShaq's story has also been reflected in art. A well-known filmmaker made a documentary about that night, including footage from the protests and interviews with people inspired by his example. The film won an award at an international film festival, further cementing BigShaq's status as a symbol of the struggle for equality. The music album he released 6 months after the incident was not just a collection of songs, but a true manifesto. In the lyrics, he spoke of pain, strength, and hope, the embrace of community, and the need to act together. The album topped the charts, and the lead song, Chain of Change, became an anthem for the justice movement. Thanks to public pressure and the efforts of the foundation, the government began a review of law enforcement policies. The reforms introduced included mandatory training of police officers on racial discrimination, improved transparency of police work, and stricter control over the behavior of officers. "This is just the beginning," BigShaq said, commenting on these changes. "We must continue to fight so that every street, every school, every job is free of hate and fear." For BigShaq, this incident was not only a challenge, but also a reminder that dignity cannot be taken away. Despite the pain and humiliation of that night, he remained true to himself and his principles. His chain, the same chain that had been ripped from his neck, now lay in a glass display case in the foundation's office. A plaque hung above it. It's not just a piece of jewelry. It's a symbol that we are stronger than hate. At the final rally, 1 year after the incident, BigShaq gathered thousands of people in the city center. His speech was the culmination of that year of struggle. "We took the first step. We've proven that we can change the world. But our journey is not over. We must continue because every human being deserves respect. Every human being deserves safety. Every human being deserves equality." The crowd broke into applause, chanting his name. BigShaq stood on the stage, looking at the people who were now more than just spectators. They had become part of his struggle, part of the movement he had started. And while the night that started it all was no longer a painful memory for him, it was a lesson for everyone. A lesson that dignity, respect, and justice would always win out. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion is very important to us. We appreciate each of you and your willingness to be part of this discussion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and give us a like if you support the fight for equality and justice. Thank you for being with us. May your day be filled with warmth, kindness, and inspiration.